Okay, so here's where I am not. Okay. So I took Gary's set of questions literally. I put my name on this question, so I wanted to talk specifically about this question. But okay, but what I wanted to talk about is the question itself. So this is a largely data-free talk. So the question that was asked here was, do cross-linguistic differences in vocabulary mean that people learning different languages come to have different conceptual categories? For this to be a meaningful question for us to ask, three things have to be true. There have to be cross-linguistic differences in word meanings. There has to be such a thing as conceptual categories. And the conceptual categories have to be potentially different from the lexical categories in order to ask if one influences the other. So let's look at part A. There have to be cross-linguistic differences in word meanings. Definitely true. There are many possible ways to map between the world and words. And I and quite a few other people have explored how different aspects of the world are encoded in words. And we have found many differences across languages in many different domains. So Bowerman had found or had talked about differences in how languages divide up some spatial locations. So in English, we have on versus in, whereas in Dutch, there are 3 different words dividing up the same relations. In Spanish, there's one that encompasses all of those 3. Of course, we know that languages have different ways of dividing up color space with different numbers of terms. Majid has found a lot of differences in what body part terms mean across languages. Common objects like furnishings. In English, we have sofa versus chair. In Mandarin, we have 2 words, but their extensions are somewhat different. These are sapa, this is separate. In English, we have cup versus glass. In Russian, these are stakan, this is chashka, and so on. So differences have been found in many other domains, such as motion, causality, mental states, geography, acts of cutting and breaking, acts of carrying and holding. So let's take up part C before we talk about B. So the conceptual categories, in order to ask the question that Gary posed, the conceptual categories have to be potentially different from the lexical categories. So we can ask if one influences the other. Most traditional literature on concepts assumes that concepts are identified by words and delineated by words. So we have concepts of in and on and chair and sofa and arm and leg and so on. But if that's true, then it's game over because of what I just illustrated. If conceptual categories are given by words, then conceptual categories are not just influenced by the language you speak, they are given by the language you speak. And so if that is what we want to take to be correct, then Wolff was actually right in the strongest sense, the sense that actually most people reject these days, that the categories of the world that you have are determined by the language you speak. So there is an out to having to accept that position, which is that our conceptual categories are not identified by words. That, however, presents the problem of what are they and how would we find them? So let's consider the middle part, that there has to be such a thing as conceptual categories to be asking our question. Well, everybody loves to say that there are such conceptual categories. Smith and Medine back in 1981 said without categories, mental life would be chaotic. Greg Murphy said that categorization is what ties past experiences to present interactions with the world. Paul Bloom said that our minds have evolved to put things in categories. But really, even some of these guys seem to think something could be fishy about these things that they've been saying. So navigating the world requires interpreting sensory input in light of stored knowledge about past experiences and other world knowledge that you might have acquired indirectly in some way. Why would navigating the world require that sensory input to be put into a category in order to retrieve stored information to help interpret it? Since when does memory, if we think about memory in general, since when does memory work such that you have to put an input into a category in order to make sense of it? So in the course of studying how people talk about things that they are familiar with, we find that a lot of very familiar objects don't necessarily have a good name or an agreed upon name. So the thing that people like to call this most of all is a thing of baby powder. Objects like this could be a carton of yogurt, a cup of yogurt, a container of yogurt. People might differ which one they want to call it, but even an individual might not always agree with him or herself from time to time, instance to instance. Some things are just very borderline. Maybe this is a bottle, maybe it's a jar, you could call it either one. This could be a cup, it could be a glass. Again, you could call it either one. So there can be trouble knowing what to call these things, but is there any trouble knowing what they are? It seems that the answer to this part is no. To talk, yes, we have to choose between competing words. That's a language production issue, but it's not a non-linguistic categorization process or issue. We understand these things perfectly well when we see this sensory input, the image on the page. We understand them perfectly well by connecting them with other similar things that we've experienced before that's stored in memory. So do there really need to be boundaries in conceptual space? And if so, what would create those boundaries if not language? I want to propose, or I'd like to think of conceptual space as a sort of outer space model. So we have an outer space model of inner space. I like to think about our experiences that are encoded in memory as being spread over very large conceptual space, with some things clustering very densely in conceptual space, other things kind of less closely affiliated with a whole set of other things in conceptual space. So we might have some biologically given clusters. So there's a set of things that have a set of correlated properties that in English we call dogs. And there's a separate set of things that have, again, a set of highly correlated set of properties, clusters of properties that we call cat. But then we have objects. So in English, the bottle as a word encompasses a very diverse set of things with many different kinds of properties: glass, plastic, ceramic, short, tall, stoppered, not stoppered, caps that come off, caps that flip up, straws in them, and so on. Jar in English encompasses a set of things that's somewhat more concentrated around a single prototype, but they overlap. So there's plenty of things that are ambiguously between bottle and jar as far as what we would want to call them. A different language may have different labeling patterns for the same parts of conceptual space. So from data we collected on Argentinian Spanish in the past, botella is a cognate of English bottle, but it's actually much more constrained to things that are glass and sort of like a wine bottle or a Coke bottle. Spanish uses other names for other parts of that conceptual space. So what we call a baby bottle in English is a mamadera in Spanish, Argentinian Spanish at least. Some other things we call bottle are bidon. Some things we call jar and some things we don't call jar are frasco in Spanish. So what I want to argue is that there are no inherent boundaries in conceptual space. It's just that there are regions of conceptual space that are associated with labels of a particular language. So to go back to the question that was originally posed to us of whether cross-linguistic differences in vocabulary mean that people learning different languages have come to have different conceptual categories, I would say that the question we should ask is, do cross-linguistic differences in vocabulary mean that people learning different languages retrieve or use elements of stored knowledge differently? And if so, how consistently across different kinds of contexts? So these things are bottles in English, and this is a bottle in English too. Neither one of them are bottle in our Argentinian Spanish, so these might be frasco, this is mamadera. I propose that the properties of these objects are, for the most part, understood and used. And the properties are understood and the objects are used in exactly the same way, regardless of what language you speak. However, it's entirely possible that because of the association of these with other things called frasco, and this perhaps not being associated with those same things, that, for instance, in a free recall task, they might trigger different sets of associations. So actually that's it. Thank you. And let me just, so this is really the bottom line here for my talk, that I think we should be asking whether cross-linguistic differences in vocabulary mean that learning different languages causes you to retrieve or use elements of stored knowledge differently. Does it mean that? And if so, how consistently across contexts? Thank you.
A question. So you admit, for example, that the differences might produce differences in behavior in something like a free recall task, but why draw a boundary there? So for example, take a task like various explicit reasoning tasks where people might, in that case, quite strategically rely on the label and, say, and reason that, well, I'm going to extend these properties to this object because it has the same name, you know, so it's likely to have those properties. And maybe you wouldn't extend those properties in the same way. So for example, you might infer that something, you know, a novel bird has all the same properties of other birds because it's a bird. And that's an effect of a label. Absent other kinds of properties that override the linguistic experience.
Yeah, that's still not saying that there are boundaries in conceptual space. What it's saying is that you're using labels to retrieve certain sets of properties that may be useful in that case. Susan Gelman actually has some old data about projection of properties across labeled categories that shows more of a gradation. So there is the fact that for basic level natural kinds, we do tend to have these clusters of instances that are separate from each other, fairly separate from each other. right, that are really structured around a set of correlated properties. And in that case, I wouldn't expect to see projection of properties. If you label something a bird, I wouldn't expect to see projection of properties that aren't shared by other birds, for instance. But when it comes to other kinds of things like artifacts, you get a much more similarity-based gradient in what you project. And you can, I mean, you can look at artifact categories and actually see that the properties really shouldn't be constrained. Your projection of properties should not be constrained by the label that you put on it, the language label, because of the fact that boundaries really are fuzzy, and the categories picked out by the words are often not particularly coherent in terms of the sets of properties that they encompass. So I've done some picking around to find examples of such things, but you get all sorts of things. Really, you don't have to look too hard. Like a knife, you know, you could say if something's a knife, it should be used for cutting, but a frosting knife is used for spreading. You don't cut with a frosting knife. You could say that a fork is used for, that's not a good example. You could say that a blanket is used for covering things to keep them warm, but you have beach blankets that are used to keep the sand from coming into contact with you. It's not keeping anything warm. You can say the bottles are for liquids, but there's a lot of bottles, things that we label bottle that people, you know, when we give them stimuli, a lot of things that people label bottle that have solids in them and not liquids. So the labels as a clue to what properties to project are only approximate. Sure. And the actual properties that you can discern of the thing really have to constrain and help direct what properties you want to project onto it.
But isn't part of it what your consideration of what other people might call a thing? So even for the Snodgrass and Vanderwart, you know, things that everybody uses, there wasn't actually as good of name agreement on all of the things if you like read the details of the original paper, right? So, you know, whether you call it a letter or an envelope or a cab or a taxi, or, you know, there's all these very, very readily available examples without even needing to look cross-linguistically about the fact that we can apply very different labels to the same thing. But what seems, the piece of this that I think is a little underexplored is your consideration of what someone else might felicitously call it, right? And I'm not totally clear on where that fits into your thinking on this.
Right, so that's another dimension of this, that it's not really that things have a label. It's that naming is highly context dependent, right? And so it depends on who you're talking to and what your common ground is, and also what you just expect them to know. So we know that we label things differently if it's a child. We label things differently if we're talking to an expert in our field versus somebody who's doesn't share that expert knowledge, and so on. Plus, just for many objects, like I've seen in my data, as you first said, for some objects like a Coke bottle, everybody says bottle, but for many, many other objects, you'll get 60% of people say bottle, 40% say jar. Some people might say shaker or cruet if it looks like it has salad dressing in it. You know, you're right. Naming is highly variable in all sorts of ways.
Are you done? Sorry, are you done answering?
Yeah, I guess I'm not. Yeah, so Elika, was your original point about the difficulty of using names to project properties?
No, you addressed my point. Yeah, I think it was just that there seems to be this dimension, which is that even though you might be forced to name a thing something, this knowledge that another person might use a different label, and you even under a different situation might use a different label. But there seems to be a social dimension of it, which isn't just what is it in your head, but your consideration of what it might be in someone else's head.
Yeah, which goes to that sort of variable mapping between words and what's there in conceptual space. Yes, yeah.
So Barbara, given all this variability, do you end up then with the view that labels don't have very much influence on conceptions because labels are used variably and conceptual groupings vary. So where does that leave the connection?
Well, as I tried to say in one of my last slides, I tend to think that at least with concrete objects that we interact with, and that would include probably things like dogs and cats, as well as household objects, whatever, that a lot of, or maybe most of how we think about them comes from our interactions with them. But like I said, in a memory task, when you're not interacting, sure, there's a lot more, it's about what you're retrieving from memory, and that could be much more guided by language. And then, as some other speakers have talked about, there are cases where much more of what we've learned comes from language and much less from direct experience. And so in that cases, I would have to predict that if languages give you different kinds of input, then what you're going to end up, like the organization of information and memory, is going to be much more language dependent.
I mean, just as one possibility that spatial relations, for example, that Bauerman talks about and that Asaf Majid has also investigated, vary a lot from one language to another. And might that be a candidate for influences from language to cognition?
Well, again, I think it kind of depends what task you're talking about. So if I am trying to put an object on a table, I don't think it really matters whether I encompass, what other relations I encompass with my word in when I'm doing that. But again, if it's some kind of more abstract task where I'm drawing on language in some way, then sure.
In the interest of time, let's go into breakouts. We'll make them 15 minutes instead of the 20, and then we'll return here. And you know, if people have to go at 3 or shortly after 3, that's fine. For the rest of the group who can stick around for a little bit longer, it'd be nice to have some discussion with everyone.
Gary, can I just make a very quick comment?
Yeah.
I think, well, one question is whether there are concepts or categories as natural kinds, and those are not always available to conscious perception or introspection, but I think there are definite cases, especially from brain data, that we know that there are natural kinds in the world. For example, faces are a natural kind, mental states are a natural kind, at least based on a lot of the data that we have. And I think it's very hard to dispute that these are not natural kinds of things in the human mind.
Sure.
Yeah, and those would correspond to the big bright clusters in my conceptual space.